I stood quietly in front of my father's grave, the weight of his passing heavy on my heart. He had been the CEO of a massive construction company, a man who built his success from the ground up. After his death, my brother-in-law, Richard, inherited the company along with $500 million. While I was left with nothing but an old car, Richard, never one to show humility, made sure to rub it in. "I've got the company and the entire estate," he said smugly. "That little car suits you." But to me, the car was more than just a rusty hand-me-down. As I stood there, I ran my hand over the faded hood and climbed inside. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered to life, and I noticed something curious. The navigation system already had a destination programmed in. "What's this?" I murmured, puzzled. Curiosity piqued. I shifted into gear and began to drive. "My name is Ethan, and I'm 45 years old. As I stand here today, I find myself not just before my father's grave, but also at the crossroads of my own life. Our relationship was complicated. He poured his life into his company, while I chose a different path. After university, I followed my heart and became a teacher, a childhood dream I couldn't ignore. My decision created a rift between us, leading to countless arguments and long stretches of silence. For years, our connection faded, strained by choices he never understood. Yet, as I drive this old car toward an unknown destination, I feel like this journey is more than just about miles on the road. Maybe it's a path to understanding him, or perhaps to finally understanding myself. I never hated my father. I had my own dreams to follow, and I couldn't give them up to run the family business, even though, as the eldest son, I felt a deep sense of duty. The guilt of not living up to his expectations weighed heavily on me, and for years, I avoided visiting my parents' home. My mother relied on my sister, Emily, to keep my father informed about my life. Emily and her husband Richard would send expensive gifts or arrange elaborate trips for our father's birthdays or anniversaries, pretending they were from me. "I wish you and Dad could talk directly," Emily often told me. "He acts strong, but I know he must feel lonely." Her words stuck with me, but I always shook them off. Life carried on until the day I received heartbreaking news: my father had cancer. Without hesitation, I quit my job and returned home. Suddenly, all the past disagreements felt small. I realized that time with him was more precious than old arguments. I decided to stay in my hometown, teach at a local school, and care for my father. When I first arrived, he was surprised to see me, but eventually, he accepted it without much conversation. I didn't explain myself. I just stayed by his side, helping him through his illness. Quiet moments passed between us, and each time he softly thanked me, I felt a sense of peace. In the end, his battle with cancer came to a close. My father passed away quietly, with me, Emily, and our mother by his side. We couldn't know what he was thinking in his final moments, but we hoped he found peace, though we had prepared ourselves. Losing him hit us deeply. Even my young nephew, Noah, mourned. The only person untouched by grief seemed to be Richard. During the funeral preparations, he asked coldly, as though he finally died. I surprised myself by staying calm. I ignored his callousness and focused on organizing the funeral, immersing myself in the arrangements to ease the pain. Richard's words faded into the background. All that mattered was honoring my father properly. Richard and I had never been close, and over the years, our relationship had only grown more strained. But it hadn't always been this way. I first met him when he was a skilled worker at my father's company. At that time, I admired him, and when he married Emily, it felt like I had gained a real brother. He was 5 years older than me and someone I looked up to. Before their marriage, I often sought his advice, trusting his guidance. One of our biggest conversations was about whether I should join the family business. I still remember his words: "You need to live your own life, Ethan. No one knows the perfect path, but the best thing you can do is make choices you won't regret." His encouragement led me to switch from business school to the education program I truly wanted to pursue. I followed my passion, while Richard and Emily started their own life together. That was 22 years ago. Over time, the distance between my father and me grew wider, and I missed the chance to bridge that gap. When I finally came home, it was too late. Richard had changed. The once friendly brother-in-law now seemed distant and cold. "You rushed back as soon as you heard he was sick," he said with an icy tone when we were alone. "But let's be clear, you're not inheriting anything." His words stunned me. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Don't pretend you don't know," he snapped. "Even if you suddenly want to run the company, it's already decided who will lead." I raised my voice, unable to hide my frustration. "That's not why I came back. I wanted to apologize to Dad, to make things right, even if it's late. Richard dismissed me with a wave. I don't need your dramatic speeches. Sounds like something from one of Emily's TV shows. Those gifts you sent were they just to stay on his good side? That's not true, I protested, but Richard had already turned away, unwilling to hear more. His words not only cut me, but also felt like a slight toward Emily. For the first time, I felt a rift growing between us, a divide that, perhaps, would never fully heal. Richard's constant mocking had started to wear on me, no matter how hard you tried to win him over. That time has passed, he sneered. Go back to your troubled students. You don't belong here. At first, I let his words get to me, questioning how others saw me, but over time, I realized Richard's behavior reflected more about his insecurities than anything else. His disrespect extended beyond me. It was clear he cared little for my father or even his wife, Emily. I began to believe Richard's marriage to Emily had more to do with gaining access to my father's company and wealth than love. When my father fell ill, Richard rarely visited or helped care for him. Now, with my father gone, the responsibility to protect his legacy weighed heavily on me. Richard presented himself as smooth and polished, but it was clear he avoided anything that didn't directly benefit him. On weekends, he played golf under the guise of business, leaving Emily to handle their son and the household. He claimed he wanted his son to learn and one day take over the business, but it left the real work to Emily. Whenever Emily voiced even the slightest concern, Richard would take her hand and say passionately, I'm doing this for him, for our family. We need to push through this together. Despite her reservations, Emily often nodded, reluctant to challenge him. Richard played the role of the devoted husband well, and I couldn't blame Emily for believing him. However, when he was alone with me, his mask slipped. Over time, I grew numb to Richard's taunts. His words no longer stung as they once did. But when my father passed away, the grief I felt was overwhelming. While Richard put on a performance of sadness for others, I sensed he had been waiting for this moment. The thought left me with a bitter ache I couldn't shake. After the funeral, the reading of my father's will shocked me. Despite being just a son-in-law, Richard inherited the majority of my father's wealth and shares in the company, equal to what Emily and I received. I expected the inheritance to be divided fairly between Emily and me, but instead, Richard walked away with almost everything. All I received was an old car my father had cherished. Richard's reaction was just as cruel as I feared. Alone with me, he chuckled and said, So, you quit your job, took care of him day and night, and all you got is this beat-up car. Meanwhile, I have the company and the estate. It's almost funny, isn't it? I gripped the car keys tightly, the cold metal grounding me in that painful moment. My family tried to console me. Dad had his reasons, Emily said softly. He loved that car. Maybe he thought leaving it to you meant something special. Their words were kind, but they couldn't ease the sting. I understood that inheritance wasn't a measure of love, but knowing Richard had taken so much still hurt deeply. It wasn't about the money, it was the principle. Seeing Richard reap the benefits of my father's hard work felt like an insult to his memory. Determined to honor the one thing my father left me, I decided to take care of the old car. Perhaps through caring for it, I could process my grief. One afternoon, I carefully washed it, letting the cool water run over the worn surface. When I climbed into the driver's seat, memories of my father filled the space around me. As I started the engine, something unusual caught my eye. The navigation system had a route preset. There were no labels, just coordinates. Curious, I decided to follow it. An hour later, the winding road led me to a modest house, far from the bustling parts of town. It wasn't grand, but it felt warm and familiar. That area was quiet, and there was no one in sight. Stepping out of the car, I hesitated at the front door, unsure why the navigation had led me here. With some reluctance, I rang the doorbell. To my surprise, the door opened to reveal my mother. I've been waiting. Ethan, she said softly. Come in, dear. Mom, why are you here? And why was this house set in Dad's navigation system? I asked, bewildered. She smiled gently. Come inside, and I'll explain everything. The interior was simple, yet cozy, just the essentials. As she prepared tea, my mother's calm presence soothed my frayed nerves. This, she began, was your father's secret retreat. I blinked in surprise. A retreat? I never knew he had a place like this. She nodded, a far-off look in her eyes. Your father built this house years ago. Whenever the pressures of work or life grew too heavy, he would come here to find peace. We often spent weekends here, just the two of us. It was his way of stepping away from the world and reconnecting with what truly mattered. I looked around the room. imagining my parents sharing quiet moments in this hidden sanctuary. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked quietly. "He wanted to," she said, resting her hand on mine. "But he didn't know how to bridge the distance that had grown between you, leaving you the car and guiding you here. It was his way of showing that, even if he couldn't say it directly, he cared deeply." Tears welled in my eyes as I grasped the significance of the house and the old car. My father's love had been there all along, hidden beneath unspoken words and misunderstandings. And in that quiet house, I finally felt close to him once again. We came here when we needed our own space or when we wanted some peace and quiet. If we ever had a small argument, our rule was to come here to cool off. "You didn't know about it, did you?" My mother's words stunned me. I had no idea such a family tradition existed. She continued, "And this is something your father wanted you to have." She handed me a brown envelope, slightly bulging, as though it held something important. Hesitant, I opened it and began reading the letter addressed to me. "Ethan, I have caused you a lot of trouble and made you endure unbearable hardships over the years. I am truly sorry from the bottom of my heart." As I read on, my father's words filled me with emotion. The letter was filled with reflections on his past mistakes and his deep gratitude for the love I had shown him. "Your mother often tells me that it was your choice to leave home, and that a son has the right to choose his own path in life. We are both stubborn, but when you came back after I fell ill, it was a wonderful surprise for me, although I couldn't express it well, because I'm not good at showing my feelings. I am deeply grateful to you for supporting and taking care of the family." This was the first time I had ever heard such heartfelt words from my father, and it made me very emotional. The letter also mentioned Richard. To tell the truth, my distress towards Richard grew over time. He's good with words and makes people feel comfortable, but I could see his true nature. I suspected his sneaky behavior around the house was his way of trying to claim ownership. I was too tired from work and taking care of you all to notice his cunning actions. But now, knowing Richard as I do, I believe these suspicions were correct. The letter continued, "I have no intention of giving the company to you, but if something unexpected happens, I have left a significant amount of money with your mother. This is to ensure that you and Emily will not be in need. Please accept it." When I finished reading, I looked up at my mother. She said nothing but kept her gaze on the brown envelope. I reached for it and checked the contents. Confirming everything was in my mother's name, she began speaking firmly. "If I transfer the accounts to you and Emily's names, it would be considered a gift under tax laws. If it's mentioned in the will, Richard might try to take it. Your father gave this money to me secretly while he was still alive to avoid Richard's interference. Now, I want to give it to you and Emily as a living gift." I was still trying to process the weight of it all when my mother showed me the account book. The amount listed was far greater than anything I had ever imagined. I had never seen so much money before, but it wasn't just the sum that mattered. What mattered was that my father had left it for me, not Richard, the person I had hoped would take over. It showed that my father truly cared about me, not just his son-in-law. This thought touched me deeply. We didn't often share deep emotional words, but I knew he always cared for us. My mother continued, "I want everything I entrusted to me to be passed on to you, Ethan, as a thank you for all the gifts you've given me." I wiped away my tears. For so long, I had believed my father never truly understood me, but I was wrong. He had always understood, and now I could see how much he valued me. That's probably why he trusted me with the old car, knowing I would value it and take care of it. "Mom, I really wish I could have done more for Dad," I said, feeling deep regret. She comforted me with a gentle smile, as though she understood the regret I felt. "It's natural to think you could have done more one morning, but you brought your father great joy. You were his greatest pride." Her words gave me strength, and I made a firm decision. I wouldn't let the company my father built fall into the hands of someone like Richard, who had been waiting for my father's death. I decided to resist, quietly planning without letting Richard know I had inherited a significant fortune. The first step was to reach out to the corporate executives my father had trusted. I wanted to ensure they supported me in preserving my father's legacy. They agreed, and their willingness to stand by me showed that my father had never spoken poorly of me. Meanwhile, my mother and Emily kept up their soothing presence during the reading of the will, maintaining their calm in front of Richard. This made him think he had succeeded, and he looked at me with arrogance. "Hey, do you, abandoned by your father, still intend to stay in this house?" Richard taunted. "I'm the new president now. Admit your defeat and go back home." He waved his hand dismissively, as though I were a nuisance it could easily dismiss. Since becoming CEO, Richard's arrogance had created a tense atmosphere in the company. Despite holding such a high position, he ignored his responsibilities, becoming rude to his staff. His behavior caused many talented employees to leave. Unhappy with his leadership, Richard refused to consider anyone else's opinion. Those who can't grasp my superior vision might as well quit immediately, he would say in public, making decisions without consultation. Meanwhile, he enjoyed spending money and living lavishly, while his passion for the business seemed to vanish. When I first met him, Richard had seemed like a great person, skilled, and even liked by my father. But now, it was clear he had changed. My mother cried every night, hiding her tears from Emily and me. I couldn't just sit back and watch the company fall apart. I continued to quietly plan my next move, determined to honor my father's legacy and protect it from someone like Richard. The day I had planned for arrived. I left home early and waited for Richard at the office. When he walked into the president's office, he was shocked to find me sitting there. "What the hell are you doing? Why are you sitting there? Get this person out of here," he demanded angrily. I remained calm. "The one who should be leaving is you. What are you talking about? Have you lost your mind?" Richard looked at me as if I were an annoying pest. "Using the assets our father left us, I bought the majority of the company's shares," I explained. "An extraordinary general meeting of shareholders was held, and you were officially removed as president." "Richard, I'm sorry to say, but you're no longer the president of this company," Richard stammered in confusion, repeating words that made no sense. "Wait, just a minute, don't you understand? I now control 2/3 of the company's shares," I said firmly. "You thought the inheritance was just an old car. That car turned into money in an unexpected way." Richard tried to press for details about the hideaway, but I skillfully avoided his questions, changing the subject. It only seemed to frustrate him more. "The game is over. Leave this place immediately," I told him calmly, handing him several documents. Richard glanced at the papers, and his face went white. "What is this?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "These are the minutes from the extraordinary general meeting of shareholders," I explained. "And this is your dismissal notice." Richard's anger flared. He crumpled the papers in his hands and shouted, "You think this will hold up? I'll take legal action." "Go ahead with the legal action," I said calmly. "We have good reasons for our actions." "What reasons?" Richard shot back. "You've just been after the old man's wealth and this company from the start. It's nothing but jealousy." I looked him squarely in the eye and asked, "Let me ask you directly, Richard, have you been using company assets for personal use? Have you been signing leasing contracts for your own benefit?" Richard's face turned pale with shock. "What if I have? What's it to you?" he replied, attempting to brush off the question. "How did you know about that?" he stammered as I listed as misconduct how he had been taking home computers and other appliances meant for the company's use. Computers and TVs that should be at the office are at your house, being used for personal things. Isn't that enough reason for action? I pressed on. Richard's composure cracked. "Why? How do you know about that?" he asked, his lips trembling. I kept my gaze fixed on him. "You should have been more aware of your responsibilities. Did you become complacent when you thought you controlled everything?" I had been quietly gathering information about Richard's actions from the company's executives. After our father passed, Richard's behavior only worsened. He had stopped pretending to respect others, and as president, he started shifting all the work onto others. He even fell asleep in his office. This created frustration among many loyal employees who had respected my father. They began to leave, disillusioned with his leadership. Richard, growing upset, doubted my ability to manage. "You've never worked a day in this company. How can someone with no experience running a company become president? It's impossible to trust management to someone like you." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "I have no intention of becoming the president of this company. My sitting in this chair is just a symbolic message to you. In fact, a new president has already been elected by a different board of directors, and they're already carrying out their duties." Richard stood frowning, mouth agape, eyes wide, shocked by the turn of events. He had believed I was scheming to replace him, but now it was clear that my only goal was to protect my father's legacy. As I've said many times, I'm not after the president's position. My only goal is to honor my father and protect the company he spent his life building. I explained calmly. "Who would believe such fancy talk?" Richard retorted. He believed I only cared about the wealth and status that came from our father, not the company's true value. After a brief moment of trembling anger, Richard composed himself. "Do you think this is over? You think you can just enjoy this?" He scoffed. With that, he stormed out of the president's office. That night, something unexpected happened. Emily threw divorce papers at Richard, ending their marriage. His misconduct at the company and his eventual firing had led to this decision. The new president was chosen from among the directors, who had respected my father and were committed to protecting the company he had built. I felt the company should be led by someone who would continue my father's legacy, a sentiment that my mother and sister fully supported. As I coordinated Richard's dismissal with the lawyers, Emily was preparing for the divorce. The day she mentioned the divorce, her voice filled the house with a heavy atmosphere. "Why do you turn away from me now? Is it because I've lost the title of president and you've lost interest in me?" Richard asked, maintaining a calm but bitter demeanor. Emily, calm but firm, replied, "There's no point in talking about betrayal. You were the one who betrayed our relationship from the start. Your love was not for me, but for the title of the president's daughter. You neglected our home, didn't help raise our children, showed no respect to our sick father, and in the end, you tried to take everything from our father for yourself. Now it's time for you to face the consequences." Richard had no response to Emily's words. She had endured so much, worrying about their children's future and the fate of the company. But thankfully, the inheritance from our father had provided her with a solid financial foundation to raise her children. After the divorce, we planned to live a peaceful life, away from the conflict, with our mother and sister by our side. Our main concern had been the possibility of retaliation from Richard. However, that fear diminished as Richard found himself out of funds. He had fallen victim to an investment scam and was now deep in debt. The scam had been orchestrated by a man posing as a representative of a brokerage firm. Persuaded by his convincing words, Richard had invested heavily and lost a significant amount. This unfortunate event served as a reminder of how easily people with sudden wealth can be exploited. Now, Richard faced the harsh financial consequences of his choices. Meanwhile, my days were filled with the simple joys of caring for my mother. I led a peaceful and comfortable life, continuing my work at the tutoring school. In addition to that, my mother and I found great joy in spending time with my nephew, Noah. His vibrant presence brought happiness into our daily routines. One afternoon, as we Saturday together, Noah declared with the boldness only a child can muster, "When I grow up, I'm going to be a president like Grandpa." His innocent words made us smile, and I saw my mother's eyes glisten with emotion. Emily and I exchanged knowing glances, our smiles reflecting the warmth and closeness we all shared. "You might feel that way now," I teased, "but I wouldn't be surprised if you decide to become a teacher when you're older." I remembered saying similar things when I was his age, which brought laughter from everyone. Noah, however, furrowed his brow and said seriously, "But I'm not very good at studying, so maybe I won't make a good teacher." His earnest expression only endeared him to us more, and our laughter at this time was filled with affection. In that moment, surrounded by family and love, I felt an overwhelming sense of happiness. We were truly living in the present, cherishing the unity and joy that came from being together.